The police killing of George Floyd is the latest manifestation of the concept known as the Minnesota paradox. Despite having one of the highest life expectancies and per capita incomes overall, the Twin Cities metro area is home to some of the largest racial inequities in the country. According to data collected by the Star Tribune last year, Minnesota ranks among the worst when it comes to gaps in poverty and home ownership, unemployment, earnings, and education. Earlier, my colleague Tanya Rivero spoke with Samuel Myers Jr., who coined the idea of the Minnesota paradox. He is a professor of human relations and social justice at the University of Minnesota.
Let me begin by clarifying the nature of the Minnesota paradox. So the issue is that there's wide racial disparities in virtually every socioeconomic indicator, but it's not necessarily because of the poor performance of African Americans. Rather, it's because of the substantial position of whites in the country. So that means that in the instance of earnings disparities, income disparities, and home ownership disparities, the values for whites are so much higher than they are for whites elsewhere in the country. And in many instances, the values for blacks are about the same as blacks elsewhere in the country. And that produces a huge racial gap. And many people have misunderstood this as meaning there's something wrong with black people. There's nothing wrong with black people. Rather, white people have a substantial advantage in Minnesota.
And so why is that? Why in the Twin Cities and Minnesota as a whole are there such substantial advantages for whites as opposed to blacks, even more so than in other regions of the country, it seems?
So first of all, Minnesota is a great place to live. It's one of the best places in the country to live. There are good schools, fantastic parks, wonderful weather. I mean, even the cold weather is wonderful. But it's clean air, clean lakes. And let me say that the quality of life is phenomenal. But it turns out that the white people who have come to Minnesota with advantages that are very much related to public policies, like the Homestead Act, like the FHA loans, the idea that there's an entitlement that white people have received. Now, in all fairness, the position of blacks in Minnesota used to be very, very sustained. In the 1930s, the home ownership rates for blacks was the highest home ownership rates in the country. And so that Minnesota has historically been not only a good place for blacks, but also a good place for whites. But then after World War II, and after expansion and urban renewal, two things happened that had adverse effects. One thing that happened is that we destroyed the black community by building a highway between St. Paul and Minneapolis. There was a vibrant, very, very, economically endowed community. It's called the Rondo community. And we decided to build a federal highway between those two cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. The effect of the destruction of that black community is that you destroyed wealth, you destroyed home ownership, and you destroyed the vibrancy of what was then extremely profitable middle-class community. So that's one thing that happened. The other thing that happened was, Minnesota's really nice people. We have a term to describe it. It's called Minnesota nice. Nice people. And we had policies in the 1970s that people described as being like welfare magnets. So very progressive policies which help to deal with issues of low income and poverty. But we tended to concentrate those dollars in certain places, and we have one zip code in the entire metropolitan area is 55411, which is one of the poorest zip codes in America. And by concentrating all of the expenditures on public housing and on criminal justice in this one zip code, it produced, remember that only 5% of the population in Minnesota is black. It produced some really big disparities.
So I want to ask you, do you think then the progressive policies of Minnesota have failed? Because politically, Minnesota is, of course, often identified as a progressive bastion in the Midwest, from the late Senator Paul Wellstone to Representative Ilhan Omar currently. And Minneapolis's white mayor, in his inauguration speech, said, quote, "We stand on stolen land in a city and state with a long history of attacking and excluding our indigenous and Black communities." So, many would look at that progressive history of elected leaders and would have assumed that, they would have brought about more change. So, how do you explain that? Is it a failure of progressive policies?
So progressive policies can sometimes have an adverse effect. If by progressive policies we believe that race doesn't matter, if progressive policies we mean that what we're going to do is we're going to solve the problem of poverty, and that we're going to attempt to erase race from our memory. Here's the problem. If the problem is race, then by redefining it as poverty, you produce a sense of distance. In fact, it gives white people a sense of empowerment to be able to say, we are not racist and that we don't have a problem with race in Minnesota. And so let's be very careful when we talk about progressive policies in Minnesota to say that sometimes progressives can be just as racist as right-wing people can be.
That's a very, very interesting observation. It's so important that we're having these conversations now about what you described as, these baked in problems that exist on so many levels in our society, not just, law enforcement and policing, but on so many basic levels. It's so important that we're having these discussions. Professor Samuel Myers Jr., thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insight and perspectives with us.
Thank you very much.